She hadn't expected the mountain to remember her, but as Claire stepped out of the car and felt the altitude press against her lungs, she understood that some places hold memory better than skin. The cabin stood where it had always been, smaller than she recalled, its wooden beams weathered by 30 summers since the one that mattered. David's truck was already parked near the stone wall. Of course it was. He had always arrived first, even when they were young, even when neither of them knew what they were racing toward. The real estate agent had been explicit. The property would be divided, sold, settled. All that remained was this final weekend to sort through what their families had left behind, when the shared ownership became too complicated to maintain. Claire told herself that was why her hands trembled as she lifted her bag from the trunk. That was why she had spent the previous night revising what she might say if he looked the same, or worse, if he looked different. But the mountain air had a way of stripping pretense, and standing there in the thin September light, she knew she had come for reasons that had nothing to do with paperwork. The door opened before she knocked. David stood in the frame, older certainly, his dark hair threaded with grey at the temples, but his eyes held the same careful observation that had unsettled her 3 decades ago. He didn't smile, didn't step forward for an embrace. He simply moved aside to let her pass, and in that gesture Claire recognized the beginning of a dance they had perfected that summer. Proximity without contact, awareness without acknowledgement. "The kitchen still smells like pine," she said, because someone had to speak first. "Everything's the same," he replied, "except the lock on the back door. I had to replace that." They stood in the front room, surrounded by furniture covered in sheets, dust suspended in the air like tiny monuments to time past. Claire set her bag down and moved toward the window that faced the valley. This was where she had stood the morning after the party, watching David chop wood in the early light, his shirt already discarded, his back marked by sun and exertion. She had gripped the windowsill then, pressing her forehead against the glass, trying to cool the heat that rose in her every time he was near. She wondered if he remembered that morning, if he had known she was watching, if he had felt the same electricity that made the air between them dangerous. Their families had been friends long before Claire and David understood what friendship meant. The cabin belonged to both, purchased jointly when property in the mountains was still affordable, a place for summers and long weekends, for children to grow up away from the city's noise. Claire's parents had brought her here every June since she was 8. David's family arrived in July. For years they had been merely playmates, building forts in the woods, catching salamanders in the creek. Existing in that easy space childhood provides before bodies complicate everything. The summer she turned 21, Claire arrived alone. Her parents were managing her grandmother's failing health and asked if she would open the cabin, air it out, make sure winter hadn't damaged anything essential. She agreed partly because she needed distance from a relationship that was ending badly, and partly because she had always loved the mountain in early summer, before the crowds arrived, when the wildflowers were still brave enough to bloom. David appeared 3 days after she did. He knocked on the door at dusk, and when she opened it, something shifted in the way he looked at her. Or perhaps something shifted in the way she let herself be seen. He had finished his first year of medical school, was tired in a way she recognized, not physical exhaustion, but the weariness of becoming someone you're not sure you want to be. They sat on the porch and talked until the stars came out, and then they talked until the stars began to fade. Somewhere in those hours, Claire understood that the boy she had climbed trees with had become a man she wanted in ways she had no language for. He stayed. There was no formal decision, no discussion of logistics. He simply didn't leave, and she didn't ask him to. They fell into a routine that felt both ancient and newly invented. Mornings they would hike, pushing deeper into the forest than they ever had as children, finding trails that seemed to exist only for them. Afternoons they read on the porch, or he would practice suturing on pieces of fruit while she sketched in notebooks she never let him see. Evenings they cooked together, their movements in the small kitchen requiring a choreography that felt dangerously intimate. His hand on her waist as he reached past her for a knife, her breath catching when their shoulders touched. They never spoke about what was happening between them, perhaps because naming it would have required decisions neither was prepared to make. David had a girlfriend waiting for him in the city, a woman Claire had met once at a family gathering, someone suitable and serious who was also studying medicine. Claire was meant to start graduate school in the fall, a program on the opposite coast, a future she had planned meticulously. To acknowledge what grew between them in that cabin would have meant dismantling lives already in motion. But the body speaks what the mouth refuses. Claire began to notice the way David's gaze would linger on her when he thought she wasn't aware. How he would find reasons to touch her, adjusting the strap of her backpack, brushing dirt from her shoulder, his fingers always a moment too slow in withdrawing. She responded in kind, learning the topography of tension, discovering how close she could stand before his breathing changed, how long she could meet his eyes before one of them had to look away. There were moments that summer when Claire thought surely they would cross the invisible line they had drawn. One afternoon they swam in the lake, and when she climbed out onto the dock, she found him watching her with such naked want that she froze, water streaming from her body, the sun beating down on them both. He stood slowly, walked toward her, and she thought this was it. This was the moment everything would change. But then a family appeared on the shore, children shrieking and splashing, and the spell broke. David turned away, dove back into the water, and when he surfaced, he was wearing that careful mask again, the one that said they were just friends enjoying summer together. Another evening they were reading by lamplight, the cabin filled with that particular quiet that comes when two people are comfortable in silence. Claire looked up to find David staring at her, his book forgotten in his lap. Their eyes met and held, and in that gaze she saw everything he wouldn't say, desire and confusion and something deeper that terrified her. She opened her mouth to speak, to name what hung between them, but he shook his head slightly, a gesture so small she almost missed it. "Don't," that gesture said. "If we don't speak it, we don't have to deal with it." So she closed her mouth and returned to her book, and they both pretended that nothing significant had passed between them. The others arrived in late July, friends from college, David's brother, a cousin of Claire's she barely knew. Suddenly, the cabin filled with noise and bodies, with beer and music, and the easy chaos of people in their 20s who believed summer would never end. Claire watched David slip into a different version of himself, louder, simpler, the careful attention he had given her now distributed among a crowd. She told herself it was relief she felt, this dilution of intensity. She told herself she was grateful for the interruption. But at night, when the others had passed out or paired off, Claire would lie in her bed and hear David moving in the room next to hers. Just a wall between them, thin enough that she could track his movements, could hear when he couldn't sleep. Sometimes she would press her hand against the wall and imagine he was doing the same on the other side, both of them awake and wanting and too afraid to bridge the distance. The party happened on a Saturday night. Someone had brought speakers, and someone else had brought enough alcohol to make bad decisions feel like destiny. Claire drank more than she intended, needing the blur, needing distance from the sharp awareness of David dancing with another woman, his hands on hips that weren't hers. She found herself on the porch with Andrew, a friend of David's brother, someone kind and uncomplicated, who was saying something about the stars. When he kissed her, she let him. When David stepped outside and saw them, she watched his face close in a way that felt like doors slamming. He left the next morning, packed his things before dawn and drove down the mountain without saying goodbye. The others filtered away over the following days, and Claire remained alone in the cabin, trying to convince herself that nothing significant had been lost, because nothing significant had been claimed. She cleaned obsessively, erasing all evidence of the summer, of the people who had filled the space, of the particular presence that had made every room feel different. On her last day, she stood at that window watching the valley, and she let herself cry for something that had never been named, and therefore could never be properly mourned. They had seen each other since, of course. Family gatherings made absence impossible. Weddings and funerals and holiday dinners, where they were polite, distant, acting as if they were nothing more than old family friends who had once spent a summer in the same place. David married the woman from medical school. Claire heard about it through her mother, declined the invitation, claiming work obligations that weren't entirely fabricated. She built her life on the other coast, became someone accomplished and independent, had relationships that were satisfying in all the ways that didn't require vulnerability. When she heard David had divorced, She felt something rise in her chest that she refused to examine. The years accumulated like snow, beautiful at first, then simply heavy. Claire watched her parents age, watched her friends marry and divorce and marry again, watched the world change in ways both subtle and dramatic. She earned her doctorate, published papers that mattered to the small community of people who cared about 19th century American literature, bought a house with a view of the ocean because she needed to live somewhere that felt like possibility. She dated men who were intelligent and accomplished, who treated her well, who never quite managed to reach the parts of herself she had cordoned off that summer on the mountain. There was Michael, who proposed on a beach in Mexico, who she almost said yes to because he represented everything sensible and adult. But standing there with the ring in his hand, she found herself thinking about a different proposal, one that had never happened, one that involved a man who was married to someone else and living a life that didn't include her. She said she needed time to think, and Michael, patient and kind, gave her space. 2 weeks later she called him and said she couldn't marry him, couldn't explain exactly why, only that it wouldn't be fair to build a life with someone when part of her heart was permanently occupied elsewhere. There was James, who understood her in ways that felt almost dangerous, who could finish her sentences and anticipate her moods, who was everything she should have wanted. They lived together for 3 years, and it was good in all the measurable ways. They laughed together, traveled well together, built a life that looked from the outside like exactly what people their age were supposed to have. But James knew, somehow he knew, that when she was quiet, when she stared out at the ocean with that particular expression, she wasn't thinking about him. He left kindly, told her he hoped she found whatever it was she was looking for, and Claire didn't tell him that she had found it 30 years ago and been too afraid to claim it. David's life unfolded differently, but toward the same essential loneliness. He married Rebecca 6 months after that summer, in a ceremony that was elegant and proper and everything their families hoped for. He told himself he loved her, and perhaps he did in the way people love those who fit neatly into their lives. Rebecca was brilliant and driven, understood the demands of medicine, wanted the same things he was supposed to want: a house in a good neighborhood, children who would attend the right schools, a life that looked from the outside like success. They had 2 children, Emma and Thomas, and David loved them with a fierceness that surprised him. He was present for their births, their first steps, their school plays and soccer games. He taught them to fish and camp, took them hiking in mountains that weren't the one that mattered. He was, by all external measures, a good father and a good husband. But Rebecca knew. Women always know. She knew that when he was quiet at dinner, when he stared out at nothing in particular, when he made love to her with tenderness but never quite the passion she craved, he was somewhere else. The divorce happened slowly, then all at once. Years of careful distance culminating in a conversation where Rebecca said she deserved someone who was fully present, and David couldn't argue because she was right. They divided assets and custody arrangements with the same careful precision they had brought to their marriage. The children adjusted because children do, and David moved into a smaller house and tried to figure out how to be alone with himself. Now here they were, decades later, standing in a cabin that had witnessed what they never acknowledged. Claire turned from the window to find David watching her with that same careful intensity. "We should start in the attic," he said. "That's where most of the personal items are stored." She nodded, grateful for the structure of tasks, for the way inventory could replace conversation. They climbed the narrow stairs together, their footsteps on the old wood sounding like a clock counting something irretrievable. The attic was hot and close, smelling of dust and cedar and the particular mustiness of things kept too long in darkness. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in her mother's precise handwriting or his father's careless scrawl. They worked in silence at first, opening containers, sorting contents into piles: keep, donate, discard. Claire found photographs of herself as a child, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding up a fish she had caught with David's help. She found books they had read aloud to each other on rainy days, margins still marked with their competing commentary. She found a swimsuit she had worn that summer, faded now to a color that barely suggested what it had been, and she remembered David's face when he first saw her wearing it. The way he had turned away so quickly, she knew he was afraid of what his expression revealed. In another box, She discovered a collection of letters she had written to David when they were teenagers, before email made correspondence instant and thoughtless. She had forgotten about these, forgotten the careful way she used to craft sentences, trying to sound casual while revealing more than she meant to. One letter in particular made her breath catch. She had been 16, writing from the cabin during a week when his family couldn't come. She described the places they usually explored together, mentioned how strange it felt to hike alone. And at the bottom she had written something she didn't remember writing. "Everything here is waiting for you to make it real again." "Do you remember the lightning storm?" David's voice came from the corner where he knelt beside a box of old camping equipment. Claire set down the letters carefully. "Which one?" "The big one, middle of August. We had gone to the ridge and got caught." She remembered. They had climbed higher than usual, pushing toward the peak, racing weather they should have respected more. The storm hit when they were still an hour from the cabin, rain so heavy it felt like the sky was trying to wash the mountain clean. They had taken shelter under an outcrop, pressed together because there was no room to be apart. Lightning split the air close enough that she could feel the electricity on her skin. Or perhaps that was just his body against hers, both of them soaked and shaking from cold or fear or something neither would name. "You said we should make a run for it," Claire said. "I thought you were insane." "You called me an idiot." "You were being an idiot." "We made it back fine. We could have died." David looked up at her then, and there was something in his face that made her breath catch the way it had under that outcrop, pressed together while the world exploded around them. "But we didn't," he said quietly. "We made it back." What she remembered most about that storm wasn't the danger but what happened after. They had burst through the cabin door, dripping and laughing with the relief of survival. David grabbed towels, threw one to her, and they stood in the kitchen patting themselves dry, their clothes plastered to their bodies. Claire looked up to find him staring at her, and the expression on his face made everything stop. He took a step toward her, and she thought finally this was happening. But then his phone rang, shrill and insistent, and it was Rebecca calling from the city, and the moment shattered. The air in the attic felt suddenly thinner. Claire turned back to her box, needing to look at something other than his face, needing to remember why distance had been necessary. She pulled out a flannel shirt she recognized as his, one he had lent her on a cold morning and never asked for back. Without thinking, she brought it to her face, and it still smelled faintly of him, or perhaps that was just memory filling in details time had eroded. "You kept that," David said, "and it wasn't a question." Claire folded the shirt carefully, placed it in the keep pile. "I kept a lot of things." "Like what?" She gestured at the pile she was building. Letters, photographs, a paperback copy of Beloved that he had given her, annotated in his handwriting. A postcard he had sent from a medical conference in Seattle, the message innocuous, but the fact that he had sent it at all meaning everything. A dried wildflower she had pressed between the pages of a book, picked from the meadow where they used to lie and watch clouds, trying to name shapes before they dissolved. "Claire." His voice was soft, uncertain. "Why did you keep all of this?" She couldn't look at him. "Why did you come this weekend? You didn't have to be here. You could have sent someone to handle your share of the sorting." "I asked you first, and I'm asking you now." There was a long silence filled only with the sound of wind against the roof and the distant call of a bird. When David finally spoke, his voice was rougher than before. "Because I've spent 30 years trying to forget this place, and I finally realized that forgetting wasn't the same as being free. Because my daughter asked me why I never talk about my past, and I couldn't tell her it was because the most important part of it involved someone I let slip away. Because I'm 52 years old, and I'm tired of living like I'm still 24 and making the safest choice." Claire felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "The safest choice," she repeated. "Is that what marrying Rebecca was?" "Yes, and it wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to me, and it definitely wasn't fair to you." He stood, crossed the small space between them. Close enough now that she could feel the heat from his body. "I made a choice that summer, Claire. I chose not to risk everything for you, and I've regretted it every single day since." She finally met his eyes, and what she saw there made her chest ache. You weren't the only one who made choices. I kissed Andrew. I pushed you away. Why? Because I was terrified. Because what I felt for you was so big, it could have swallowed my entire life. Because you had Rebecca and I had graduate school, and it was easier to believe we were doing the mature thing by not destroying everything for one summer of wanting. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I've spent 3 decades trying to convince myself I made the right choice. Trying to believe that protecting our friendship was more important than taking the risk. And David's hand came up slowly, tentatively, and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone. Did you convince yourself? No, she whispered. I never stopped wanting you. I never stopped wondering what might have happened if we'd been brave enough. They stood there in the hot attic, surrounded by the detritus of their shared past, and Claire felt the weight of all those years pressing down on them. Every choice they had made, every person they had loved without fully loving, every moment they had pretended indifference while their hearts were breaking, it all led to this moment, to standing close enough to touch in a place that remembered who they had been before fear made cowards of them both. I should make coffee, she said, stepping back, needing air, needing space to remember how to breathe without accounting for his presence in every inhalation. In the kitchen, she filled the old percolator with hands that shook more than they should. Through the window, she could see the woodpile where David had worked that morning so long ago, where she had watched him from this exact spot, wanting him with an intensity that frightened her. She had been 21 then, stupid with youth, believing that wanting something badly enough made it permissible to have. Now she was 51, old enough to know that wanting changes nothing about what's possible or wise. David came down the stairs slowly. She heard each step, heard the particular creak of the 7th board that had always announced arrival. He entered the kitchen and leaned against the counter, maintaining distance but somehow filling all the available space. Why did you really come? He asked. The property needs to be settled. You could have hired someone to do this, sent lawyers, signed papers remotely. So could you. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. I asked you first. Claire poured coffee into 2 mugs, the same chipped ceramic they had used that summer. She handed him one, their fingers brushing again, that same electric recognition. I don't know, she said finally, which was both a lie and the deepest truth she could manage. Maybe I wanted to see if the place still felt the same. Does it? She met his eyes, and the careful performance they had maintained for 3 decades cracked just enough to let something true slip through. Yeah, she said, that's the problem. They took their coffee to the porch, sat in the old rocking chairs that their parents had occupied for years, talking about weather and politics, and the ordinary concerns of people who didn't have histories that burned like embers, never properly extinguished. The afternoon stretched long and golden, autumn beginning its slow consumption of summer, and they talked about everything except what mattered. David told her about his practice, his 2 children who were grown now and making their own complicated choices. Claire described her work, the satisfaction of tenure, the house she had bought near the ocean because she needed to live somewhere that felt like possibility. What they didn't say filled the spaces between words. They didn't say that his marriage had ended because he could never fully arrive in it, that some part of him had stayed on this mountain with a woman he never kissed. They didn't say that Claire's relationships always founded on her inability to let anyone pass the careful walls she had constructed, or that she sometimes wondered if she had used that summer as an excuse to never risk herself again. They didn't say that seeing each other now felt like touching a bruise that had never healed, painful and somehow necessary. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, Claire stood to start dinner. David followed her into the kitchen, and they moved around each other with that same dangerous choreography, reaching and pivoting, the space between them charged with memory. Claire was cutting vegetables when the knife slipped, biting into her thumb. She gasped, more from surprise than pain, and suddenly David was there, his hand wrapping around her wrist, his training making the response automatic. "Let me see," he said, his voice shifting into the professional calm she imagined he used with patience. "It's just a nick. Let me see, Claire." She let him turn her hand over, let him examine the small wound with careful attention. He ran water over it, pressed a clean towel against the cut. His touch gentle and somehow more intimate than if he had kissed her. She was aware of his thumb on the inside of her wrist, whether he could feel her pulse hammering, whether he knew what his proximity did to her breathing. "You'll live," he said, but he didn't release her hand. They stood there, water still running in the sink, the towel going red in small blooms, and Claire thought about that lightning storm, about being pressed together with nowhere to retreat, about how sometimes the most dangerous moments are the ones when you're forced to acknowledge what you've been running from. "David," she started, but he shook his head. "Don't," he said quietly, "not yet." He wrapped her thumb in gauze with the precision of someone who had done it thousands of times, and then he stepped back, creating distance that felt like a physical loss. They finished making dinner in silence, the ease between them replaced by a tension that made every casual touch feel weighted with significance. They ate on the porch as darkness settled over the mountain, and Claire tried to remember why she had convinced herself that this weekend would be simple, manageable, just a task to be completed before returning to lives that didn't intersect. After dinner, David suggested they light a fire in the old pit behind the cabin. It was unnecessary, the night wasn't cold, but Claire understood he was reaching for ritual, for something to occupy their hands and give them permission to sit in silence. They gathered wood from the shed, and David built the fire with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. And soon flames were climbing into the darkness, casting shadows that made the familiar strange. They sat on the bench their fathers had built, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, far enough that they weren't quite touching. Above them, stars were beginning to emerge, the same constellations they had traced that summer, lying on their backs in the meadow, naming patterns and inventing stories about the shapes they found. "Do you ever wonder," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what would have happened if we had been braver?" Claire felt something crack open in her chest, a fissure she had spent years keeping sealed. Every day, she said, he turned to look at her, and in the firelight his face was the same as it had been at 24, open, uncertain, wanting something he was afraid to name. "I almost came back," he said, "that fall, after you left for graduate school. I drove halfway here before I turned around." "Why did you turn around?" "Because you kissed Andrew. Because I thought I had misread everything between us. Because I was a coward." Claire closed her eyes against the sharp ache of those words. "He meant nothing to me. I was trying to." She trailed off, uncertain how to finish, uncertain whether honesty would help or only deepen the wound. "Trying to what?" "Trying to make what I felt for you smaller, trying to prove I could want someone else, trying to protect myself from you." She opened her eyes, met his gaze directly. "I was terrified of how much I wanted you, David. You had this girlfriend, this whole life planned out. I had graduate school and a future I couldn't even imagine changing. And more than that, I was scared that if we tried and it didn't work, I would lose you completely. At least this way I could keep you at the edges of my life." "And did that work?" His voice was rough now, stripped of its earlier carefulness. "Keeping me at the edges? No," she said simply. "It's the thing I regret most." The fire snapped and settled, sending sparks spiraling upward. David reached for her hand, and this time there was nothing accidental about the contact. His fingers laced through hers, and the sensation was so overwhelming that Claire had to concentrate on breathing. 30 years dissolved, and she was 21 again, standing at that window, wanting him with every cell in her body, too afraid to reach for what she wanted most. "I married Rebecca because she was safe," David said, still holding her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on her palm. "Because being with her didn't feel like standing on the edge of a cliff. Because I could be married to her and still protect the part of myself that belonged to one summer on this mountain." He paused, his jaw tightening. "That wasn't fair to her. It wasn't fair to me, and it sure as hell wasn't fair to you. You don't owe me anything, David. Maybe not, but I owe myself the truth. And I owe you that too." He turned on the bench so he was fully facing her, and the intensity in his eyes made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. I have loved you, since the night we talked until dawn. Since the morning I watched you stand at that window and realized you were watching me. Since every moment we pretended what we felt was ordinary friendship. I have loved you through my marriage and divorce, through every time I saw you at a family dinner and had to act like my heart wasn't trying to climb out of my chest. I have loved you for 30 years, and I am so tired of pretending I don't. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to retrieve, too big to ignore. Claire felt tears sliding down her face, hot and surprising, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why tell me now when we're both 50 and the best years are behind us?" "Because we're both 50, David said, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because I'm tired of being careful. Because I can't die without you knowing what you meant to me, what you still mean." He raised his hand to her face, his thumb catching a tear, his touch so gentle it broke something in her. "Because maybe the best years aren't behind us. Maybe they're waiting to see if we're finally brave enough to claim them." Claire leaned into his touch, 30 years of wanting finally given permission. "I'm so angry at us," and she said, her voice breaking, "at all the time we wasted being afraid, at all the ways we chose safety over this. I know, I'm angry too." He moved closer, his forehead coming to rest against hers, and they breathed the same air, occupied the same impossible moment. "But we're here now. That has to count for something." She pulled back just enough to see his face clearly, needing to memorize every line, every change that time had written on his features. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We live on opposite coasts. We have whole lives built around the fact that we're not together. I have tenure, you have your practice, we have—" He stopped her with a kiss. It wasn't gentle or questioning. It was 30 years of hunger finally allowed to surface, 3 decades of touching and not touching, of wanting and denying, of love carefully hidden, because naming it would have required too much courage. Claire felt herself falling into it, her hands gripping his shirt, pulling him closer, trying to erase the distance they had maintained for so long. His mouth tasted like coffee and regret and possibility, and she thought distantly that this was what drowning must feel like, terrifying and necessary, and somehow exactly right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Claire rested her head against his chest and listened to his heart hammer beneath her ear. His arms wrapped around her, holding her with a fierceness that spoke of all the years he hadn't been allowed to hold her. They stayed like that while the fire burned down to embers, while the night deepened around them, while the mountain kept its ancient witness. "I don't know how to do this," Claire said finally, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I don't know how to dismantle a life and rebuild it around something I should have chosen 30 years ago." "Neither do I," David admitted. "But maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight. Maybe we just start with being honest about what we want." "What do you want?" She felt him take a deep breath, felt the rise and fall of his chest beneath her cheek. "I want mornings where I wake up and you're the first thing I see. I want to cook dinner with you every night. I want to bring you coffee in bed and know your face better than I know my own. I want to stop pretending we're just old friends and admit that you're the person I measure everyone else against. I want years, Claire. However many we have left, I want them with you." The tears came again, harder this time, and she let them fall. "I want that too," she said. "I'm terrified of it, but I want it so much it hurts." They stayed by the fire until it was nothing but ash and memory, talking about logistics in the way middle-aged people must, about retirement accounts and property divisions, about children who would need explanations and friends who might not understand. They talked about the difficulties of merging lives that had been separate for so long, about the risk of discovering that the reality couldn't match the dream they had carried for 3 decades. But underneath all the practical concerns was the simple truth that neither of them was willing to choose safety again, not when bravery had finally become possible. That night, Claire lay in the bedroom she had slept in as a girl, in the bed where she had dreamed of David just down the hall. But this time he wasn't down the hall. This time he was beside her, his body warm against hers, his breath soft on her neck, his hand resting on her hip with a possessiveness that made her feel claimed in the best way. They didn't make love, there would be time for that, they decided. Time to explore what bodies that had wanted each other for so long could create together. Instead, They held each other with a tenderness that felt more intimate than sex, skin to skin, heart to heart, finally allowing themselves to be vulnerable in ways they had protected against for decades. In the darkness, Claire traced the lines of David's face with her fingers, learning him the way she should have learned him 30 years ago. She felt the rough stubble on his jaw, the soft skin at his temple, the warmth of his breath against her palm. He caught her hand, brought it to his lips, kissed each fingertip with a deliberation that made her heart ache. "I used to imagine this," and she whispered, "lying here with you, wondering what it would feel like to stop fighting what I wanted. What does it feel like? Like coming home, like finally being able to breathe properly." She pressed closer to him, needing the solid reality of his body against hers. "Like I've been holding my breath for 30 years and just now realized I could let it go." They talked in whispers until sleep came, sharing confessions they had held for decades. David told her about the nights after his children were born, how he would hold them and wonder what children he and Claire might have made together, what family they might have built if they had been brave enough. Claire told him about the morning she almost called him 6 months after his divorce, how she had dialed all but the last digit before losing her courage. They shared regrets and near misses, all the moments when they had almost chosen differently, almost been brave enough. "No more almosts," David said as sleep was finally claiming them. "No more near misses." "No more," Claire agreed, and she let herself sink into sleep wrapped in his arms, safer than she had felt in 3 decades. In the morning, Claire woke to find David already up, standing at that window where she had watched him so many years ago. She came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, felt him lean back into her embrace. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That we should keep this place," and he said, "not sell it. Keep it as somewhere that's ours." "That's impractical. Neither of us lives anywhere near here." "I know, but this is where we finally got it right. This is where we stopped being afraid." He turned in her arms, his hands framing her face. "And maybe someday our grandchildren will spend a summer here, and they'll be braver than we were." Claire smiled, rising on her toes to kiss him, a morning kiss that was soft and domestic and full of promise. "Okay," she said, "we'll keep it." They spent the rest of the weekend sorting through the cabin, but now every task felt different, weighted with future rather than past. They decided what to keep and what to discard, but they also decided which room would be theirs, where they might add a deck, how they might expand the kitchen. They made love on Sunday afternoon in the bedroom that had witnessed their decades of longing. And it was awkward and imperfect and more satisfying than anything Claire had experienced, because it was finally honest. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets that smelled of cedar and new beginnings, David traced patterns on her shoulder with his fingertips. "I keep expecting to wake up," he said. "To find out this was another dream, where I finally tell you the truth and you disappear." "I'm not going anywhere," Claire promised. "Not this time. I'm going to hold you to that." They showered together, learning the geography of bodies that time had changed, but somehow made more interesting. Claire traced the scar on David's shoulder from a surgery to repair a rotator cuff injury. He kissed the mark on her hip where she had fallen off her bike 2 years ago. They were not the people they had been at 21, and that was good, that was right. They were people who had lived and lost and learned what it cost to choose safety over desire. On their last evening, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the valley. Claire's head rested on David's shoulder, his arm around her waist, and they didn't talk much because there was no longer anything they needed to hide. "I still don't know how to do this," Claire said as darkness gathered. "How to take what we started this weekend and turn it into a life." "Me neither," David admitted, "but I'm willing to try, are you?" She thought about the woman she had been at 21, too afraid to risk herself on love that felt too big. She thought about all the years she had spent being careful, being safe, building a life that was satisfying in every way except the one that mattered most. She thought about the man beside her, who had loved her quietly for 3 decades, who had been brave enough to finally speak the truth, who was offering her a second chance at something she had believed was forever lost. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." They left the mountain on Monday morning, both of them driving away, but no longer driving apart. They had exchanged keys, made plans, decided on dates when they would see each other again. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about merging two lives built in separation could be. But it was honest and it was brave, and it was finally, after 30 years of silence, exactly what they both wanted. Claire stopped at the end of the drive and looked back at the cabin. David pulled up beside her, rolled down his window. "Regrets?" he asked. "About this weekend?" "No." "About the last 30 years?" "More than I can count." She smiled at him. This man she had loved longer than she had known how to name it. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't that we got it right the first time. Maybe the point is that we finally got brave enough to try again. He reached through the window, took her hand, squeezed once. "I'll call you tonight. You better." She watched him drive away, and she thought about the summer they had wasted being afraid, about all the years of loving him from a distance, about the moment 2 nights ago when he had finally said what they both knew, and she had finally let herself hear it. She thought about the risk they were taking, about how much could go wrong, about all the ways this second chance might fail. Then she put her car in gear and followed him down the mountain, choosing bravery over fear, choosing love over safety, choosing at 51 what she had been too afraid to choose at 21. Some stories don't have perfect endings because they begin with imperfect courage. But some stories get a second chance, and Claire decided that was worth every year of waiting, worth every moment of silence, worth the risk of trying again. If you've ever loved someone quietly for years, if you've ever been too afraid to say what you felt until it seemed too late, if you've ever wondered what might have happened if you had been braver, this story was for you. Some loves wait decades to be spoken. Some truths require a lifetime of courage to say out loud, and sometimes the best thing we can do is finally be honest about what we've always known. Your story matters. Share it in the comments if this touched something you've been carrying in silence.